welcome you all to the 8th seminar in our series on science and semi-peripheries. Today, we would like to welcome our special guest, that is Mariya Ivancheva, who will share with us her research and give us a talk titled The Double Bind of Academic Freedom, State and or Market Capture in UK and Venezuela. So Mariya is an anthropologist and sociologist of higher education and labor. She has carried out historically grounded and theoretically informed ethnographic fieldwork and interdisciplinary mixed method research in different regions of the world, including Eastern and Western Europe, South America, and Southern Africa. Her academic and research-driven advocacy work focus on the casualization and digitalization of academic labor, the reproduction of intersectional inequalities at universities and high-skilled labor markets, and the role of academic and student communities in broader process of social change, especially in transitions to from socialism. So very pleased to welcome you to our seminar, to having you with us. I would also like to mention briefly how we will proceed during the seminar. So first of all, we would like to invite our guest to give her talk that will last for around 40 minutes. Then we would like to ask our colleague Christian, also from our research group, who will join in and sort of pose some questions and problems to which Mariya then will later respond. And after that, as usual, we will like to invite all the participants to join in during this phase. Please use the inbuilt raise your hand button in the Zoom application, so we can manage the discussion. So I think without further ado, we can start. And once again, Mariya, welcome. And the floor or screen, as you wish, is all yours. So good luck.
Thank you very much, Kuba. And yes, I will share my screen. Thanks everybody for coming, being here, and for inviting me. It was a challenge. It is interesting now how what I'm going to present is rather a kind of paper that I've published as a book chapter, but it brings together quite a lot of different strands within my work, which is, as mentioned, quite interdisciplinary and translocal in some ways. And I'm trying to kind of hold the tension here that hopefully I manage, but I'm looking forward to your thoughts and challenges as well. So how the presentation will be structured is that I will first give account of some definitional issues around academic freedom and around core periphery dynamics, and a bit of a background to the talk first. Then I'll speak about the UK, which, as you all know, might be the most marketized public higher education system. This is not to be confused with the US archipelago of all sorts of different experience that still is, you know, with very mixed ownership. So now I'm speaking of public higher education in specific. And then I'm gonna get out of the UK and see what happens in systems that at least try to present alternatives like Venezuela to marketized higher education and socialist alternatives, hopefully, and to see how academic freedom works there given the core periphery dynamics of the global field of higher education. And I'll end up with some reflections. So what you're seeing here is a bit of a, as I said, you know, it's a bit of a camouflage, not a camouflage, now I'm thinking of a different word, a bit of a bricolage rather, of different papers or four. It's my paper on the discrete charm of university autonomy, conflicting legacy in the Venezuelan student movements. My work with Kathleen Lynch on academic freedom and the commercialization of the universities, a critical ethical analysis, which was focusing more on the Irish case, even if zooming out into the global perspective. A special issue that we did with Ivo Syndicus of higher education reform in the periphery with kind of big inverted commas. And this paper that I'm presenting, which is part of a new collection that should be coming out this year, Opening Up the University, Thinking and Learning with Refugees, that was edited by Celine Cantati and Cook and Prem Rajaram, and is gonna appear in Berkham. So this paper is soon gonna be out. It's already out, I think, in preprint. So, you know, academic freedom. When I think of academic freedom, and this was a concept that I very much encountered in Latin America as something perhaps, you know, positive or like a matter of an actual dispute. So at the time that I was working there, like which was the 2000s, this was not a big topic in academic discussions, and it has come back relatively recently, especially around developments in Central Europe, interestingly, including Poland, around the closure of whole universities and the removal, like my former alma mater, like Central European University, but also the closures of departments and so forth. But what was interesting for me to kind of trace in that is that there's not one model of academic freedom. No, we speak of it as if it's a concept that we all agree on, but actually this convention is quite shaky when you think of its past. And it always has to do with, you know, freedom for whom and freedom for what and of what. And we can think of, for instance, the Humboldtian freedom that was of Lehrfreiheit and Lernfreiheit, so of, you know, teaching and learning in a way, or research and teaching, but without protection from the politics of the day. So, you know, academics could do whatever they wanted within academia, but without really kind of having much claim on everyday politics within the German kind of states. And then you had the Napoleonic version, which had very little freedom, you know, in a way, like in this model, you had a lot of security for public, or, you know, you can have also for clerical servants loyal to the secular or religious power. So there was not much understanding that the scholar should serve anybody, but, you know, the kind of meta representation of the public in a state or in a religious authority. Then with the research intensive US academic model, there was quite a different, rather individual or guild privilege that was presented, and that offered what I think nowadays we think of academic freedom, which meant certain privileges and protections for academic intellectuals in public life. And there's another very important trajectory, which is not often mentioned in European and Eurocentric debates of academic freedom, but is quite important when you speak of public universities, which is the Córdoba reform from 1918 and its manifesto, where students in the Argentinian town of Córdoba fought for political, legal, financial, and teaching and learning freedom from universities. And that also meant a specific kind of autonomy of university campuses from police intervention, which is very important for the Venezuelan case that we're going to be studying. It also meant possibility for democratic co-governance of the university on behalf of the students, academics, the public, transparent recruitment, and something that in that discourse is very important asset, which is the so-called, let's say in English, that would be outreach, which is extension, like extension programs, and it is connected to work with communities. So whereas there was an expectation for universities to be autonomous and to have kind of internal autonomy of their governance structures and finance, they had to do service to the community through this type of internships and applied knowledge production with communities that each and every student has been obliged to do. And of course, this has kind of become a much more tokenistic aspect of higher education in Latin America and has been sometimes turned just to benefit businesses, but we'll probably come to that. Now, there has been, as I mentioned, a new hype around academic freedom, and it has meant as much noise as silencing certain aspects. So there has been an overemphasis on repressive state in peripheral location, especially in the global south, but not only, especially in the global east as well. And the reason why this has been quite important, first in like the late 80s, with the so-called, I wouldn't necessarily call it liberation, but let's put it like this, just in inverted commas, of the former socialist world. But then also nowadays with the new rising, especially right-wing populist regimes, has meant a kind of liberal backlash against the state capture of democratic institutions, and the kind of silence around that is what is the alternative that is envisaged behind such a view, which is, well, a state capture blocks capital and free market competition. So as long as there is free market, the university is safe and healthy, but the state should not intervene. And so there has been in most of these discussions, and that's something that we discuss in depth with Kathleen Lynch, an under-emphasis on the market dynamic in higher education and an over-emphasis on the state as such, rather than zoom in on what are the underpinning state projects and how they engage with market regulation. Now, how does that play in the core periphery dynamics? I mean, it's a bigger question and probably deserves a talk on its own, but I thought to just share one paragraph of reflection in our introduction to the special issue with Evo Syndicus that I think kind of captures some of these issues quite well. So ideologically, the global agenda that revolves around a common set of policy reforms evokes an imagery of a horizontal leveling of the playing field of higher education. So this idea that every university can technically compete for global ranking as if we all stand on the same footing is very benevolently liberal, but of course it conceals more than it reveals global inequalities. It suggests an equality of opportunity of sorts for all universities to partake in the competition for a top position of excellence in the production and dissemination of knowledge. At least in principle, such a model suggests the possibility for all individual universities and national university systems to produce universally relevant and recognized knowledge, move up in the global rankings, recruit international students and faculty, and host key scientific debates within a homogenized field of higher education with ever more similar standards across the globe. In its logical consequence, this free market model would lead to results that contrast with the rather fixed position of countries and university sectors in an unevenly developed world system in which higher education agendas in core and peripheral context are clearly delineated. So, freedom in this case is a relative illusion. And we are here also to speak of some of these dynamics and how they play out in different contexts as the UK and Venezuela, but we could possibly extend this discussion further and speak of East Central Europe, where I am from, where I have done some of my studies as well. So the UK, I mean, for me, the UK is one of these very clear cases where the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So you have something that used to be probably the most successful public system of higher education in the world, because it managed to combine, on the one hand, massification and equal access and social justice agenda, with, on the other hand, academic excellence in knowledge production, and attractivity to relatively fixed, stable positions in terms of recruitment, but also like a kind of clear career structure and a lot of openness about the possibility to do research, present your findings, and engage in a dialogue around them. So, that meant that in the post-World War II era, there was a kind of quite a steep increase of number of institutions, especially after 1992, when a lot of former polytechnics were pushed into becoming universities, receiving university chapters. But there was a kind of parallel process that was quite cynical and went along with it. And that was a continuous assault on all functions of the public university, that is research, teaching, and service. It started, of course, on the one hand with the introduction of fees for students and the commercialization of higher education, but it also had some much more perilous dynamic around how the budget of universities was curtailed and then abused against the interest of the academic community. So in a very kind of cynical way, we had the introduction of frames like value for money and kind of push for employability framework for students. In a certain way, what happened was that the former polytechnics that were offering vocational training are now supposed to become universities that compete for academic excellence, and universities are like former non-polytechnic universities like Russell Group and other ones are supposed to provide vocational training for students. So you almost had a displacement, which nowadays, with the lack of caps on numbers at Russell Group universities especially, means that a lot of the second-tier institutions might be actually threatened with closure and bankrupt. And we've just balloted again for strikes. But what it has meant in terms of just focusing on academics and our work is that there has been this introduction of a new budget, which in which instead of having a discrete full budget given to the institution that it can then decide how to divide into teaching and research, the block grant, this kind of block grant has been suspended, and what academics have to do in terms of research is a cyclical funding application, often with pre-known results, in the sense that the same institutions follow the Winnie the Pooh maxim that the more you get, the more you get, the more it trains, the more it trains. And there is also a very huge redistribution of patents and profit from public into private hands through this. So there is an increased kind of insistence on academia industry interface, which basically means academics work with stakeholders from the private sector, which, for instance, gain patents over their work and gain profit, or can dictate certain kind of limitations to what can be published or not that can be harmful for their reputation as businesses. And a lot of the funding still comes from the public. So we're having cases like, as you might remember recently, the AstraZeneca vaccine that was developed with no more than 95% of public funding. But obviously it's not the public that gets the benefits out of all these vaccines being sold to different states and stakeholders. So that means, in terms of research also, that there is a very new, completely different managerial structure in universities, just among academics. I'm not even speaking now of how academics are managed, but you have a kind of stratification between VIP academics that have portfolio in fundraising from external sources, that are then given the choice of hiring, on the one hand, researchers that do their research, data collection, and on the other, teaching faculty who teach for them in teaching only precarious contracts. At present in the UK, that's 58% of the teaching workforce is on teaching only precarious contracts. And there is an even further push for outsourcing towards private companies that provide digital education together with universities. I was working previously in a program where 80% of all my colleagues were outsourced academics, not hired by the University of Liverpool, but doing research supervision with a PhD program within the university. And that also means that there is a much more, a kind of much bigger push towards teaching content to be dumped down and made freely available in modularized forms online, so that even that 58% of the teaching workforce can be made disposable, so that most of the resources can be put back into the big fundraising machines of top academics. And so it becomes quite an unsustainable, but quite a scary model, quite a stratified model, and it really skews, this idea of what does it mean to have freedom of research if you're always under a PI that has all the power and all the funds. And you either write articles for them or you replace teach for them. So students are fed to this illusion that they're taught by the VIP academics that form the rankings, but usually they're taught by teaching only faculty that have no research portfolio because there's no funding for that. And this teaching is ever more monitored through digital technology. So like speaking of freedom there is, also kind of quite shady. And then there is this question of what the service stand in for then. And service in this case stands in for impact. Impact can mean either working with private companies and benefiting their profit, which is translated allegedly to profit for the larger society, or it means, and that's an even more cynical twist, a way of redistribution of public sources that are given for the budget that operates the university, that is given to private companies that construct and run dormitories, gyms, innovation districts. So there is a constant wage theft going on, and on the other, there is always bigger harvesting of data on the university campuses, because a lot of these actors are kind of invited through the front door and lay the red carpet in order to enter. So where is the space for academic freedom in all that is an ever growing question. I can give examples, some of which I would have to be very careful, because a lot of these companies do come after you and threaten to sue the university or yourself if you harm their reputation. And I've probably done a fair bit of that by now. So so in this way, we're like, I'm kind of inviting you to think a bit, where can one even envisage academic freedom in a situation like this, where the state doesn't bother to intervene. The most the state has intervened in the recent while was deciding not to cap student numbers at Russell Group universities, which has put the sector at very big risk, because that meant that all students wanted to go to top universities, and most of the smaller universities have been undersubscribed. But that's the role of the state, and it's not the state that limits the academic freedom directly, but it is the state market nexus and the way that it is managed that is doing that in a very, very subtle, but also very maverick way. It is like bulldozering through a lot of rights in order to achieve success for a very small number of private companies and players. And who pays the price for that? This is a slide from Advanced Higher Education, which is rebranded Higher Education Academy, which used to be a public institution that dealt with teaching. Now it has a CEO and a completely new name, and has, a hashtag, and presents itself in a completely different way. But anyway, they collect data, and this is the data that shows the staff, student staff pipeline, first by gender and then by ethnic identity and gender intersected. And what you see here, is how this dynamic plays into the success or lack thereof of female academics on the advanced academic job market. So we have more than 50% of students entering universities are women. At the research postgraduate, that's usually PhD level. That means, that the number falls a bit lower, and then it's, through getting hired on the first permanent contract as an academic staff lower, and then as professors, it's lower in times. But what you can't see here, and similarly with the Black or ethnic minority female and white male academic, there is between 0.2 and 0.3, so between research postgraduate and permanent academic staff, there is a huge number. This is 77,000 atypical contracts, very feminized, very precarious workforce. That is very much captured in this perpetual lack of freedom, and it's freedom to develop, freedom to have an opinion, freedom to choose what to teach and what not, freedom to switch on and off the camera when you're asked to record your lectures. And basically many times it's very scary development that leaves a lot of people in permanent fright, and it's very difficult to unionize people in such positions because they move around, so there's very little sense of loyalty to institutions, and it's not their fault. It's not our fault, but it is a kind of very significant structural constraint that makes terms like academic freedom profoundly precarious. Now, the contrast with Venezuela, and also, so Venezuela higher education was a strong higher education system, much less massified, so it served a very specific, small, usually white elite, like the one that was present, and it was also unlike higher education in core countries, peripheries, as Philip Albach has also claimed, show a much stronger connection between the university and politics of the day, and party politics especially we're speaking, but also movement politics. So a lot of the fight for academic freedom in Venezuela in the 20th century had to do with trying to get rid of initially authoritarian regimes. So in the 1930s with Generación del 28, they were trying to get rid of Juan Vicente Gomez. Some of the leaders of that movement were then back trying to fight in the 1950s, with the same party names, Acción Democrática, COPEI, UARD, and the Partido Comunista de Venezuela, so the Communist Party, against dictator Marcos Pérez Jiménez. And they managed, together with a very significant popular revolt. But then what happened was, when liberals came to power in the 60s, the Communist Party was still outlawed, so they still had to fight from the trenches and from illegality. And universities became like autonomous. There were 5 autonomous public universities. They became the only oasis of free thought and fight against the liberal, but actually quite authoritarian regimes of ADE and COPEI. And in the late 1960s, early 1970s, that ended in a very strong fight for academic freedom among especially communist youth on autonomous universities, who were trying to use academic freedom and autonomy, like territorial autonomy within university settings, to fend off the police, fend off the powers that be, and not be massacred, but still gain certain reform within the university of what curriculum was going to be introduced, how students were going to be hired, who was going to be co-governing or not the university, and so forth. A lot of them lost their lives at that moment, and those who joined Hugo Chavez many years later still had a very strong memory, very visceral memory of how their comrades lost their lives in that era through that contestation. So when Hugo Chavez came to power as a result of a kind of first anti-neoliberal riot, then he and his comrades galvanized in 1992 through an unsuccessful coup d'etat that left him in prison, and then through election that brought him to power in 1998. They reached out to some of these academic intellectuals to also initiate higher education reform. And what is not well known is that before the higher education reform that has now become world famous of the new Bolivarian universities, there was an attempt for like the first 4 years of Chavez in power, so from 1999 to 2003, to actually reform existing institutions. So reforming existing institutions, which were publicly funded, became impossible because the former, well, not former, let's say, the people who formerly opposed academic freedom at universities had now taken it as a main asset in their struggle against the socialist reform of universities. So a lot of oppositional powers, a lot of intellectuals that wanted the ancien regime to continue existing and to continue yielding mostly privilege for their own special social class, were not willing to allow the democratically elected government since 1998 to enter institutions, to enter universities, to do any kind of reform, to massify them, which has been the dream of a lot of people that entered power together with Hugo Chavez. And so academic freedom was used by them to say, no, you can't enter. We're going to decide what we're going to do with these institutions. And at that moment, that could have been quite an interesting moment of tension, perhaps, where new choices are made about academic freedom, but possibly because the people around Chavez were those who came from these movements that fought with their lives for academic freedom in the 1960s and 70s. They said, yes, okay, let's keep it like this. We're not going to touch your academic freedom. We are going to set in a whole new set of institutions that are going to be for the public, that are going to be for the poor, and that are going to be trying to create this social change that we believe in. And then you come on our side because you see how nice it is. There was only one episode that contradicted that logic and that presented the possibility for conflict. It was in 2001 with the movement for university transformation, when a group of left-leaning academics at the Central University of Caracas, Venezuela, in Caracas, occupied the like a central building there, and were kind of willing to engage in dialogue with Chavez of how to push the governance structures that prevent massification and progressive reform, and have the government actually implement some of its ideas at public universities. But because of, I'd say very contingent reason, but also because Chavez did not take this up, and because people around him did not want to renege on a promise of academic freedom they had kind of vowed over back in the past, this moment was lost. And in 2003, the Bolivarian University was founded, and so were all the university, like kind of decentralized university classrooms, which accommodated, by official count, over 500,000 students. They got to hire socialist intellectuals with past in the traditional universities and new educated lower middle and working class people with first generation in higher education who were to become the new faculty, because the demand was so high and they wanted to accept everybody who wanted to go into higher education. They needed to very quickly train these new educators in order to enter the academic field, provide education, but also and this is where it became tricky, gain accreditation and make this university like a properly functioning public institution according to all the rules of what it means to be a university. And this is where they encountered a very big resistance again, because in order to do that, they had to comply to rules that were not made by them, but were made by the rules of the global field of higher education and the job market in a country with very skewed like petro economy. So, what that meant was, on the one hand, when it came to research, there were all sorts of impediments to these people who entered usually with a bachelor's degree to teach at these new universities, to actually be to be seen as academics. So they had no publications, they had very little research portfolio, they had no fundraising record, and they had to teach technically from 7 in the morning till 9 in the evening, different groups of very challenging, like also very rewarding students from all sorts of classes, but some of them had just come out of alphabetization programs. So it wasn't your usual student in their 20s, fresh out of high school. There were much more complex cognitive demands. There were much more time constraints of a lot of women, people with caring responsibilities, full-time workers, and so forth. And on top of that, they had to develop a whole new portfolio of research that had to be, on the one hand, radical and subversive, but on the other, get into publications that were peer-reviewed and accredited, usually by the other side of the divide, so the academics that didn't want to acknowledge their existence and didn't want to accredit the university. That also meant that they had to play a very difficult game with their students, because a lot of the students entered higher education with the promise that that would lead to jobs. Because in a country where more than 40%, and probably now more, is governed, like of the job market is in the informal and gray economy, the high-skilled labor market that offers just any security is usually connected to having some kind of technical or higher degree. But once students came into Bolivariana, there was no promise of jobs, because actually they could not reform the job market. There was very little violence that was applied on private company. The private sector was actually growing. The public sector continued in its more advantaged positions to hire people from traditional universities because they were considered to have a better skill set. So a lot of the students from the Bolivarian institutions were not given a chance to even enter like a master's degree program at a conventional university, and instead had to perhaps just start a new degree if they wanted to get into the high-skilled sector. But on top of that, they were taught, and that was the kind of hidden curriculum perhaps, that they should not want a job in the traditional job market. They want to become like full-time community organizers for their communities to solve the problems of the community. So there was a very progressive part of this education that kind of promised students that all of their education would be targeting the so-called extension, the work with marginalized and poor communities in order to help them mobilize and solve their problems. But a lot of times, and that was something, very, very cynical, the logic of how that could happen was very much mimicking what we know, especially in East Central Europe, as the NGO logic of, applying for funding. So if you want to be a good community organizer, you have to learn how to apply for funding with communal banks. So in order to be a good faculty, in these cases, you also have to be good at fundraising, So in a certain way, there was a lot of reproduction of in a kind of peripheral and perhaps low-key way for the time being, of the same logic that already played elsewhere, like in the UK, which is, cyclical funding that you always have to apply for. And what happened was that a lot of middle class people and communities were much more successful than students from Bolivariano to succeed in this funding. So eventually, by the time that I left, and I followed from afar, but like in the early 2010s, it was becoming more like the university was facing a kind of double bind as well. On the one hand, by either becoming a traditional university and complying to all the rules of the game, of the academic game of research, teaching, and service, as it happens elsewhere and as the traditional universities in the country complied with, or going off the beaten path, but really being ever more marginalized and its students not gaining any significant credit for all the work they're doing. And so this is here where, it's quite interesting to think of a case like Venezuela in terms of trying, the kind of what it happens when within the existing capitalist system, a progressive project for social change takes hold over the state and attempts to present, its reforms that are aimed at integrating the broader public into higher education and into society. But then it is stopped by the very academic freedom that its proponents have been also defending back in the past. So sometimes I think we get too caught up in concepts like academic freedom that stop functioning the same way when the balance of power changes. And I think it is quite important to think again of what's the nexus between the state and the market. And is it always that we're trying to defend the university against the state, or is it against certain types of state market connections and assemblages that we try to protect it against? And are there other cases where we actually have to let academic freedom go and think of what are the ways to make a meaningful kind of public intervention? So on this note, just a few remarks as a means of conclusion, and leave the floor to Christian. But ambiguous concepts such as academic freedom can be subverted and used against their transformative reading. I think that's one of the take-home messages, from this talk, definitely. We're having, very different constellations and conjunctures in which the UK and Venezuela function, but we see kind of more or less, sadly, in a certain way, we're seeing similar outcomes. We're seeing a public system of higher education that follows rules from outside and is getting either further commercialized, or in the parts that it can't, like the post-1992s and the Bolivarian institution, it gets marginalized and close to bankruptcy and closure. And we're having a university system that has to function within a system where the job market and funding is tailored in a way that it supports certain big private corporations and their rights to take hold over knowledge and power. In Venezuela, that's obviously the petrol industry, and the public and private in that case can decide the fate of the country to a large extent, and that can continue hiring people from top tier institutions instead of really trying to kind of implement social change also through its hiring practices. And so state intervention under so-called illiberal regimes are undeniable and need urgent actions, yet insistence on freedom from the state conceals bigger enclosures on university autonomy from state-enabled market processes and forces performed within liberal, anti-liberal North and South regimes alike. Semi-peripheral alternatives require mechanisms to protect freedom that resist all definitions and centrifugal forces within the global field of higher education. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the very interesting talk, and I think that Christian will be able to pick from here and continue onwards with this topic.
Okay, here I go. Thank you very much, Maria, for this super insightful paper. And I think that's while I'm sure, because I've read some of your recent papers, I'm sure that you could like continue and analyze this empirical material like for the next hour or so, or even more. Yeah, like for me, the great fun starts always when the empirical material is on the table and we can think a little bit more about the concepts, methods, and theories. But that's my specificity, and I'm really grateful that you provided not only the empirical material but also a lot of powerful thoughts about how dysfunctional is the liberal concept of academic freedom, because in its essentialist way, because I would say this is something to which you're thinking on essential okay, sorry, like I think that most of your recent interventions is about thinking academic freedom beyond this essentialist liberal paradigm and within the material configuration of relations of power between the social actors. And these two cases are excellent to even strengthen this position further, because yeah, and I like to think about this also in the context of the Polish case, one of this Eastern quasi-dictatorial contexts. This is how liberal press likes to frame the situation in Poland, that we are like losing here the grounds for the rule of law, and some right-wing quasi-dictatorship is emerging and spoiling the European Union. And why the Polish context adds here some sort of an insight. I don't claim that there is some commonality, really obvious commonality between this absolutely superbly various contexts like Venezuela, UK, and Poland. They do not have much materially and historically in common. Yet at the same time, when we would realize, and some of our participants in the seminar are maybe not familiar with that this right-wing government here in Poland recently proposed something like a reform packet for extension of academic freedom, which is specifically understood as extension of the freedom of speech, meaning expansion of a right to express, for example, homophobic or nationalist claims within the walls of the university, or for example anti-abortion claims, or for example, I don't know, even like a flat earth opinions. But this reform package goes under the sign of expansion of academic freedom in Poland. From these three cases, we see that, and this is what I would like to highlight. We see that academic freedom is some sort of Ernesto Laclau would say empty signifier, something that simply shows us what are the current state of the tension between the different various actors within the social field, like between the state, between the market forces, between the some sort of a class forces in the society. And I think that from your presentation, the Venezuelan case was here like shedding so much light on that, like when you especially when you emphasize that what was important was to see the reaction of the conservative forces within Venezuelan societies and their change of mind that happened suddenly when like few years back they were fighting against students demanding academic freedom, and then suddenly with the Chavezian government, Bolivarian government, they took the opposite side and starting to take the academic freedom they took academic freedom under their banners. And while I don't want to propose any form of like empirical analysis because I haven't done so much research about the topic, what I would like to know more is that your opinion about some sort of about your thinking about this like more materialist take on academic freedom and analysis of how this concept helps us in understanding the class antagonism in which higher education systems are involved, because I think that this is something that we need to take in mind, seeing such examples like UK or more especially Venezuela, that academic freedom is a concept that's or academic autonomy is a concept that simply comes in a way any form of progressivist changes in the sector. What is important is academic labor autonomy or academic labor freedom. If this would be a framing of our resistance and struggles, then it would be much more problematic to be hijacked by conservative and liberal forces, because when we understand that I would say here a phrase, a slogan from protests that took place 12 years ago in California. Students from collective Research and Destroy, they asked a question during the hot wave of protests in Californian campuses like 12 years ago. Nobody remembers that right now, but it happened that I translated a pamphlet that dealt with the issue of academic freedom, and they asked, what is a free university in a capitalist society? This is nothing more than a simple library in prison. And so I would say the fight for academic freedom in capitalism resembles this, like demand for establishing a library in a prison, while the task should be to simply abolish the prison itself. Because while I would really enjoy to have a library in my prison, I think this is not exactly the real progressive research environment in which I would like to continue my task. So maybe there was not much questions, but it was like some sort of an intervention, what I'm thinking of in context of your powerful research that I would really love to treat the synthesis paper. And yeah, I really congratulate you.
So thank you, Christian, for giving us this intervention. Mariya, would you like to respond to Christian talk?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I like the idea of labor. Thanks for this, and for reading and for engaging. And I like the idea of academic labor autonomy. you know, like my kind of always worry is almost with everything, as I said, you know, this idea that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It's almost, you almost have to predict where capitalism is going to capture some progressive idea on the next round. You know, you propose something like this, and then you almost have to think, you know, what would be the next kind of level of nastiness that they're going to come up with that's going to subvert that. You know, in a very kind of Boltanski and Shapiro way, you know, what's the new spirit of capitalism going to be promising, and what part of our critique is it going to take in, and what is it going to kind of let boomerang against us. And so in a certain way, I think universities possibly, you know, we can think of them from within where we're standing, or within a, say, communist horizon. No? Within the communist horizon, the universities would disappear. You know, we would not need these institutions that perpetuate distinction and differences in a society that maybe wants to be a bit more equal. While at the same time, while we have them and while they are the turf of our struggle, no, I think we have the license to think of them as being, at present, I'd say even more than ever, an actual arena of class struggle. And that has to do, you know, I think in Venezuela it's even more visible because you're having a kind of current massification project. Whereas in the UK, you had a massification project that has then been subverted. And at present, a lot of the struggle is more on the faculty level, where you have people on 100,000 and people on 10,000 doing the exact same job. And sadly, what's worse, being part of the same trade union and having to decide on issues around, you know, what are our priorities and what are the issues that we want to address. And I can give some examples, you know, more recently of issues that have concerned me around that. You know, so say at present, our union, for the most part, did vote to fight for pensions and did not vote to fight for the so-called forced fights, which was against casualization and for gender and ethnic equality and so on and so forth. And it's not, I'm sure, you know, most people care about these topics in general, but, you know, they don't think that they should be actually spending their funds on that. And this is actually quite sad and quite scary, but it is even scarier where people who are on 10,000 and who are dependent on a PI or line manager of some sort have to sit next to them in the same union and decide together with them, you know, who has the priority. So in a certain way, you know, the kind of material basis of this struggle, I think is very important to understand. And now there have been a few projects going on around workers' inquiry, you know, like kind of really understanding the class composition in academia to understand how that struggle should be led. But we just have to stop thinking of academics as being from the same class to begin with, you know, like, and then once you put the global into that, you know, it becomes even more complicated. So in that way, I think this is one issue where kind of presenting a concept as academic freedom as a blanket, you know, resolution for problems in academia is dangerous, you know, because it is completely blind to all these differentials, and then it kind of lets off the hook people who have never, you know, who got a permanent job at 20 and never moved their finger to change a lecture, or, you know, like people that are struggling as hell, or people that are, you know, in a VIP position and had hunted for 500,000 a year, or you know, and you're just kind of thinking, who the hell should have academic freedom? Like who is the subject that we're trying to encourage through this? And so for me, you know, we kind of almost have to work backward, and this is the difficult part, and agree on a kind of concept of where the university can fit the bill of a kind of transformative project for society, and on that basis think of, you know, who is to gain freedom and who is not. And that's where, you know, the right-wingers having tried to speak against abortion and against LGBTQI communities and so forth is, that's where it becomes dangerous, because we, if the project that we have agreed on is one of transformation through an equal society, then there's no place where those who have had the license for generations and centuries can keep this right and deny freedom, autonomy of people who have been, groups that have been traditionally marginalized. But sadly, we're not in that place. We're at the place where the conflict over what is the transformative project in society has kind of actually expanded very significantly, where Eastern European societies, because of their specific trajectory, post-transformation, have actually come on a kind of very wrong footing. And we are now, in a place where expertise has been denied any license and legitimacy for a good reason, but at the same time, we're coming to a place where, because of that, a lot of progressive academics and knowledge producers are going to be basically witch hunted, probably out of institutions, to be replaced with either mediocrity or, what's worse, malevolence. And so like that's kind of my comment on that. I guess that's where we're, where the problem is that we don't have the convention of what's the project that we want to work towards. So then academic freedom just becomes this, but not just empty signifier, but it becomes a kind of like a mot de guerre. It's like a kind of actual concept that produces struggle, and that different fractions use and reinterpret in a way in order to get an upper hand for their project in the situation. And I think, coming from a more armchair perspective rather than political, it's like, at least we need to make sure that we are forensically kind of delineating, where that stands, and how it is used in different cases. And then from there, with the more political mind, we have to think of how we perhaps, subvert the conservative concepts and use them to kind of reach out to populations that are bought by them, but that might also have a more benevolent idea of, where society should develop towards.
All right, thank you very much both for your talk and now for this response. So at this point, I would like to open the floor if Kristen have something to add, and maybe continue on some things that you touched upon in your conversation. Then there will be opportunity for that during the question round. So I'm asking the audience, the participants now, would you like to join if any of you have some questions that you would like to ask our guest? Okay, I can see that Emmanuel raised his hand, so please do.
Thanks, Mariya. Thank you for a very insightful presentation. I like it very much. And I would like to ask you about your opinion about Venezuela as the case. Is this Venezuelan case representative for Latin America, or rather it's a unique case which allows you to show the specificity of the UK case? Because, for instance, from my perspective, UK higher education system and organization of science and perspective for academic freedom is quite unique. There are no many similar systems, probably to some extent Australian or the system in the US, but I wonder how it is with Venezuela in the region of Latin America. Could you please shed some light on this?
Yeah, so the way that I think of this, and so for me, a lot of these systems actually, there's a lot of cross-semination between them. So I think you're right, the UK is pretty unique. At the same time, I think the UK, by being first most successful, most visible, and then kind of rapidly changing and offering also the means of that transformation, has been informing a lot of reform elsewhere, especially in the post-colonial world. Also, like I'm thinking, thinking South Africa. Like when you're speaking of South African higher education, it's actually quite similar to the UK. I mean, you're having these two tiers. Of course, they come from a different kind of, not just class, but much more intersectional race and class kind of tier, and much more, the scissor is much more open, so to speak. But a lot of the structural processes are very similar. I think a lot of countries in Europe will soon be taking over more from the UK than we would like to see. So I'd focus on that country also because I think a lot of public systems of higher education that are commercializing are looking up to the UK rather than looking down to it, which I think they should do, technically speaking. And I think more than that, also similarly with the, I guess with the Venezuelan case, that there are unique characteristics, and there are a lot of things in common because they come from a certain trajectory of development of universities through this, usually hybrid mixture of some of these models. How unique is, I didn't use Venezuela to underline the UK. For me, these are just two contexts that I have worked on among many and that I find contrasting the most. So I like comparison by contrast. And I think it kind of works in a strange way here. Venezuela comes also from a trajectory of progressive higher education, which I'd say, like the USSR, parts of the socialist bloc, African socialist countries, China, like a lot of socialist countries have been thinking along some of these lines. And for me, it's always been, and I've never managed to do it, much myself, always been interesting to see which are these features that have been in common between all of them and which are the ones that they have done differently and how much they have actually informed each other, because my sense is that they haven't much, that there has been very little information going on between this, like in the sense of deep information, in the sense of like real kind of policy borrowing, with expertise and thinking about, what can be done in the local application, rather than just knowing that there's workers' education and we do it like this. Venezuela in the Latin American continent, I think it used to be a very typical public system of higher education. The Chavista project was, what kind of came to really make it different. But I think by now it's kind of come to just be like many other, first and second tier public systems of higher education. So it stops being that unique in a certain way. And that's actually sad. Miko?
Yeah, Miko, exactly.
Great, thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. I'm a little bit of a newbie here. I'm coming through Christian because Christian does alienation of higher education, and I'm doing alienation of higher education here in Finland. And I saw this being advertised and I wanted to join. Thank you very much for the presentation. I think it was very interesting, and you said quite correctly that most of the different higher education systems, they have their own peculiarities, but they're still going in the same direction. And I wonder if you can identify something that combines these market imaginaries across the board from the UK and Australia to Venezuela and further to Finland. I'm thinking it could be the knowledge-based economies paradigm or something along those lines. Would you agree with that?
Yes and no. I mean, yes, but I have to qualify that. So what does that mean? like knowledge-based economies. For me, what really can bring them all together is redistribution from the public to the private. That's it. Like if you call it knowledge economy, free to go, it's usually used because it is such a nice euphemistic way to say it. You have knowledge and you have economy, and it's kind of cool. But actually, it is knowledge at the service of not just the economy, but of the free market economy and the free market actors that are going to be, actually pushing ever further an agenda for university that is going to serve them. So you're having kind of whole set of issues that are related to that. And I've mentioned some of them, but I'd say another one, this kind of concept of employability is quite interesting, because you're having increasingly a kind of understanding of a university that has to serve private businesses by providing cheap labor force, educated cheap labor force, so high skilled labor force. So you're having situations like in Ireland, where Google is hiring academics, through projects, on public money, kind of public salaries, to do research work that in the private sector would cost a lot. And universities that are like UCD, where I heard that, are very proud of themselves for providing businesses this cheap, PhDs and postdocs and whatever that are doing research for the corporation. You're having a situation like in Denmark. There was a recent book by Sue Wright and collaborators that shows very well, where kind of the industrial sector of the country has very much kind of really streamlined the agenda of universities into, subservience to industries in terms of also all levels of decision making, subject fields of governance, who's going to come on, and so on and so forth. And once you have this kind of nexus between academia and industry that serves predominantly industry, and it's nothing bad if it's industry, but it's industry that has only commercial profit and only, with the expectation of actually, like internally generated profits rather than redistribution back into society, then it starts being a problem. So, and I think this is the kind of main thing that's going to bring all these countries, especially advanced capitalist democracies, into that mix. And I think it's very interesting what happens once the periphery or semi-periphery kind of starts playing that game as well. Because on the one hand, we're doing that with some kind of illusion, I think, at times that it is, say, the UK is advantaging like local businesses in order to advance its society. Yeah. So what would happen like in my home country, Bulgaria, if that happens? But that's not necessarily the case. I mean, a lot of these local businesses are not local businesses at all. They're like corporations that are registered in tax havens. There's nothing from them that brings value back into the economy of the country. So you're having a kind of, I think, next level of deregulation, where all this idea that, knowledge economy feeds back into the kind of national benefit is gone. It's an illusion. It comes from the past. And we should get rid of that and be very careful of who invests and who gets the profit, because at present it is the public invests and the privates get the profit. Yeah? So that would be my response. This would be the one thing that I see. And the way that the students, for instance, get into that, and that's where fees come very handy in, is like you have more and more fees introduced, and then you have debt. And then how do you pay back student debt? Well, you work for the corporation. So you're having a very readily prepared and presented workforce for the corporation. And that's, the US has it, Australia has it, the UK has it. And now, next in your country when fees are introduced. and students become more and more kind of dependent on this. And I think the more English language education is developed, the more that is going to happen. So we're having almost like a globalization project, which is kind of benevolent about not sharing of knowledge findings and blah blah, pitted against a kind of global corporate imaginary of limitless recruitment of cheap cadres in for profit, and we have to be very careful around that. How not to kind of slide into a conservative agenda that kind of comes back to traditional national languages and values predominantly, but on the other hand produces some kind of alternatives to this corporate bullshit.
Okay, I also seen that Christian wanted to add something. Correct?
I have some thoughts that I can present, and we can continue discussing. But maybe there is someone else wanting to,
I don't
add up
see
the discussion.
further questions, so
I don't know. Like for me, one of the interesting issues covered by Mariya is this idea of borrowing from the UK thing, and reading these developments that in her works on critique of political economy of higher education in the UK, Mariya covers. I think that's like when I was reading recent papers by Mariya, I simply thought, okay, why for the UK this issue of online provision, online learning is so much more important that here in Poland. And there is one part of, I don't even remember which of the many articles of Mariya, where she discussed the internal transformation of the UK system, and Joe Johnson idea of how this online program management systems could lead to Russell Group universities taking the lead of online system provision, and the others simply disappear, and bunch of sacked academics will simply provide the teaching online. But then I started to understand the system in the global complexity and the role of peripheries, because like to adapt to this line of thinking, why this difference between the problems that you touched in your articles was for me so striking, because most of the critical discussions about the capitalist changes in Poland or this part of Europe deals with, at least this is my perspective, deals with the transformation of research system, incentives of research, and so on. And I started to think, are we so developed that we are like focusing mostly on research? No, it's simply like the way how the peripheral countries are starting to be, included into this homogenizing space, which then in the end will make them countries of the lesser category. Also in terms of providing of instruction, like if you are and we will be like this polytechnical universities, post-polytechniques in the UK that will simply provide some like some sort of I don't know, like being a labor appendage to the general online machine of instruction located in some Oxford or anywhere. So yeah, that was like just thinking aloud, thanks to your intervention, and I think that this will be the package that we will borrow from the UK, like to restructure the system and plug it in into the global system of instruction. And this risk that is involved in this situation is that the response will be nationalism, and it's already happening. Like this form of global inclusion of higher education is unacceptable for most of the countries, and as soon they will realize, they will come up with the standard response, which is like to cut the ties and so on.
But I think you're very right to say that, and there is you're almost having a kind of very, very unpleasant conundrum in peripheral and semi-peripheral locations. And I'd say semi-peripheral, it's more visible, you know, and as you're saying, no, I recently, just before I got my current job, I worked a few like small jobs on the side because I was on a part-time contract. And one was with a colleague of ours, very established, respectful, and nice colleague of ours, working on issues of research, evaluation, and, you know, visibility. And I had to do some interviews with people in the OECD, the World Bank, you know, like big kind of organizations around research. And I can tell you something. First, like one thing that happened was like research and teaching are completely split there. Research is not research any longer, it's innovation and industry. Teaching doesn't care about research. They really don't care. No, we might think in Bulgaria, Poland, Argentina, and I don't know where, that what matters is our citation and all sorts of, you know, global visibility issues that are going to bring students maybe to our departments. No, you know, what they care about is unbundling the teaching curriculum, getting it more and more connected to private companies, which are going to start dictating what is going to be taught, and are going to be, you know, with the help of other private companies teaching that. So as an excellent academic in Poland, your best kind of career trajectory would rather be to be hired by a Russell Group university or, you know, some American university to be doing instruction in their outsourced program, because that, you know, but probably on a Polish salary, because, you know, free trade agreements work that way. They're funny like that. So it's not a very promising future, and it almost feels like one has, you know, kind of sold themselves very low by feeding into that system, by producing this type of publications that we were fed to think that are going to be bringing us to a, you know, like a research excellence agenda. And then the only way that serves is to get more people doing, you know, like so George Johnson's idea would be have only Russell Group universities stay because they're able to expand and with their brand sell everywhere. And they're going to be hiring semi-peripheral and peripheral academics to do the instruction, which they already do. So that's not something new. It's just the scale is still very small. And then the question is, you know, we're having the conundrum that I mentioned, you know, like on the one hand, there is this kind of cosmopolitan academic that has been part of this game, that has been trying to shame almost the local academy for being parochial, for not advancing research the same way that the big nations do it, of being invisible, of publishing only in local languages, and so on and so forth. And then the backlash against them is this kind of almost old, you know, populist versus urbanites conflict, you know, in which you have the parochial like academia come back criticizing you for having engaged in that quite rightly, but also offering a very retrograde reverse project, you know, and that's I guess
yeah,
where
this is exactly what's happening in Poland right now. Exactly this, like coming back of parochial academic that propose its own for the right purpose, like having a right on his side, because the other process is like not bringing the benefits. So yeah.
All right. We do have several minutes, so if there is any last question, we can take it. Maybe someone has an idea how we can sort of end on a more positive note, because I think that Mariya insight was quite powerful, and to be honest, I must agree with her diagnosis. So maybe anyone have some sort of more cheerful way of concluding our meeting today.
Or if not, we have the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will. So we can maybe, but I see Alexandra has switched on, so please.
Yeah. I don't know if it's going to be positive, and also I don't know, like, you know, like I'm not like working in like the philosophy of higher education, but I was wondering if you know about this. There is this trend in the United States, like they call it the Great Resignation, where like a lot of people are like leaving their jobs or changing their jobs because of like how the COVID pandemic kind of laid bare how the system is treating people, really. And I was wondering if you think maybe specifically maybe in the UK, but also in the US, is like if this like pandemic is also kind of laying bare how the universities are treating us and or like as academics, and that maybe there is a little bit of a kind of a shift in just like perception of like the mechanisms, and a little bit of waking up and maybe being more I don't know, like outspoken against it, or there's some like actions against it. I don't know in the UK, but I have like witnessed a lot of my colleagues in the US that like just really realizing how things are, like how they're being exploited, how like their own health doesn't matter for the university, but the profit does. So I don't know, do you think in any way that the pandemic is in a way a little bit of a positive force, or maybe not really? But
I don't. Like I can just answer in no, but I know what you're saying. I think it has been very important for shedding light on all of this, but it has also been very important in showing how precarious we are, how even people in very permanent positions and, you know, with relative job security can be made very insecure in terms of health and safety, in terms of being deployed as soldiers, you know, on the front line without any protection for no good reason. But, you know, the promise that students can come back and occupy dorms and pay big fees to private companies that are running the dorms. So we were shown that our life has no value. But was there a sector where, like, even, you know, the most frontline sectors, say, you know, think health, for instance, or agriculture, or, I mean, I can go on, care.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
okay. So did we get the sense that these people were indispensable? Yes. Did we get the sense that they're going to be getting more security, stability, protection from the capitalist system? No. Very, very straightforward. And I think it was very telling that a lot of times universities and other employers were using the pandemic in order to kind of promote further assault on labor rights rather than, you know, say, oh, we actually really value you. And that's where digital comes in, because, you know, it out of a sudden, like all of a sudden, they kind of decided to show us that we're literally displaceable by technology, which we might not be, given that, you know, students are in an extreme mental health epidemic and so forth. But the kind of timing of it all, the anxiety around getting jobs at the end of the day and being able to pay the bills, especially when you need to have a place to stay during a pandemic and lockdown, has just produced this kind of monstrous effects of fright and of isolation that is very difficult to fight collectively. And so I'm not very positive, but I do think, you know, it did shed light. And sadly with academia, you know, like there's a lot of going on in terms of universities saying, oh my God, we figured out that like our students, you know, our PhDs don't get academic jobs, only 10% are gonna get, so let's promote ways outside of academia. Is there a job market outside of academia where there's no precarity and, you know, like well, except maybe like top corporate jobs and stuff, where you actually have security. For people in the social sciences and humanities, what is it like, the NGOs, publishing sector? Like which are these green pastures where we can migrate to and feel more acknowledged and, you know, more secure? It's not easy. So yes and no.
Thank you for this answer.
All right, so I think we can finish right on time. I would like to once again thank to all the participants, and of course especially our guest who kindly agreed to join us today and discuss this topic. So just a brief mention that we are meeting together next week for the 9th seminar in our series. We will be welcoming Lucia Cespedes to discuss languages of sciences in the Latin American scientific field. So if you're sort of interested in this kind of multilingualism perspective that we have discussed last week, then please join us next week. We hope to see you again. Once again, big thanks for today's seminar and for all your insights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Thanks for inviting. Have a nice
Thank you.
evening.
Thank you very
Bye
much.
bye.